Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Drones 101 presentation. Feel free to come on in from the hallway. I think maybe there's a couple chairs, maybe not. Maybe post up on the side. But yeah, we're going to go and get started. So anyway, I'm Chris Brelow with Duncan Parnell. Just a quick thing about us. We are the Trimble Southeast distributor and obviously drones as well. That's why I'm here. But yeah, we're here for all your hardware, software, solution needs. And yeah, we'll talk about basics about drones. So I've got a few slides here we'll kind of work through. I'll actually poll the audience, just raise your hand. Who's currently flying drones in your actual, maybe not on the weekends, that's cool too, but for actual commercial purposes? Okay, actually less than I thought. Well, good. This will be a little bit of foundational information for most of y'all. If you've been flying drones for a long time, I hope there might be a couple of nuggets as well that may help as far as, I don't know, regulatory evolution, things of that nature. So anyway, my background really quick, just some places I've been, things I've done, whatever. I have to give a shout out though, it is one of the best days of the year today. Tar Heels advanced. We can debate later if they shouldn't have been in, but hey, they smoked somebody. So go Heels, but yeah, kind of evolved through some different things, local government, private sector stuff, tree, canopy assessment, things of that nature, and now of course Duncan Parnell. So a bunch of different roles and companies, but all GIS based, and now it's really more on the data acquisition side. Obviously, that's what drones do for us. To also get my priors out of the way, here's a bunch of the different brands we represent at Duncan Parnell, from the airframe side, from the sensor side, from the software side. So bonus points, you can name what each of those logoless airframes actually represent. So just a quick outline for today. I find that in talking to folks, which is my job every single day, hey, what are you trying to accomplish? What do you want to do with drones, blah, blah, blah. There's so many, like everything else, right? So many acronyms, so many abbreviations. Do I need to be on the blue list? Like all these sorts of things. So we'll try to kind of level set that first and then kind of move through that, just some kind of random observations I've formulated talking to customers every single day in this, and then a couple case studies at the end. But please do stop me at any time. If someone's like, hey, can you explain that part again, whatever, like please, this is meant to be a little more discussion-based if we can. I know it's not the best maybe format for that, but I like to keep it that way if we can. So please shout it out, raise your hand, whatever, and we'll do that. So obviously it's the GIS conference. I don't know if anyone's local government GIS person here. When I was doing that didn't mean I just mapped things, right? Maybe that's what you got started. I also did stuff for public safety, for fire department. So we find ourselves, I think, a lot of times in GIS wearing a lot of different hats. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is certainly mapping use cases, updated imagery, getting your surface models, maybe we're modeling power lines, things of that nature, stockpile quantification, right? That's kind of the low-hanging fruit, the very obvious stuff. And then other things that folks are doing could include pressure washing, obviously public safety, search and rescue, roof inspection. But I think if you are in a municipal context particularly, you might do updated impervious surface calcs right on that subdivision. You don't want to wait for the next wintertime man flight, get it with a drone really quick. You might support public safety monitoring. Maybe you're not embedded in PD, but maybe you're supporting them, right? So the use cases are really limitless. And to a quick callback to the prior presentation on AI, we're just collecting more data, right? If you can get what you need from the NAEP program someone was talking about or from Google Street View or whatever, do that, right? So the drone is not always the answer, but it's a very versatile and powerful tool depending on your application, and that's a super obvious statement. Now this is really a mapping focus, just kind of keys to success piece here. So again, if you're doing an inspection, kind of you could throw most of this out the window, at least the first part. But at this point, I would say if you're doing high-end LiDAR for topo applications, digital twins, things of that nature, even honestly, if you're getting away from DJI, you're going to log static data, right? You're going to go pull a core station that's maybe within 20 kilometers of your project area, or you'll set up your own receiver to log static. If you do that, you can get good data out of pretty much anything with some caveats, but that at least sets you up for success from the geotagging perspective. A lot of folks get hung up because you come from a DJI background. Who doesn't love using DJI? We can talk about there's some issues with that are known and maybe not as known, but outside of them, others do implement RTK on the drone, but it's not always reliable for a whole host of reasons. Point 2 here, right sensor for the job, right? I love, again, that last presentation. They're pulling Bing imagery to detect poles. You don't need a 1 centimeter GSD to do that. That's just not necessary. Plus, you couldn't fly a whole county or state with the drone. You do other things, right? So match your sensor for the application, obviously. LiDAR is obviously very versatile. It's also very expensive, right? So if you're trying to do topo through the woods, you're going to have a LiDAR sensor. Again, obvious statement. If you're trying to do volumetrics on a landfill, you don't need LiDAR unless it's maybe super overgrown. And then aircraft-wise, everybody wants that magic silver bullet, that one airframe that will do everything. That is pretty much a unicorn at this point. Maybe the Matrice 4E might actually be that, but those are also hard to get through reasons that we can talk about. But most part, you got to say, hey, am I doing longer flight times? Is it a gas hybrid? Am I doing fixed wing for efficiency, things of that nature? Am I doing a simple inspection? I've had people call me and say, hey man, go to Best Buy, buy a Mini 4 Pro today. You don't need to worry about the rest of this stuff. You just want pictures and video, right? So right tool for the job, understand your use cases. So this in a different format is actually, I break down each of these kind of terms to know. Hopefully many of these things are familiar to a lot of you. I'm gonna kind of rip through them really quick just to again kind of level set for us here. So the first, they're really all related for the most part to a LiDAR acquisition, right? The inertial measurement unit, your roll, pitch, and yaw, that sensor orientation, that is really the critical foundational piece of a good LiDAR acquisition, right? If that IMU is cheaper, if that IMU has some issues, if you mess up with your base, all the data downstream from that is just garbage. So when you're evaluating like, hey, is this LiDAR actually a good deal? That price sure is good. Just double check yourself that IMU is actually gonna hang for what you need to do. Related to that IMU is the trajectory itself, right? The actual flight lines, that mission plan that you've done. And again, if that IMU is not the best, you're gonna have trouble or challenges in post-processing to actually get a locked-in trajectory. And then LiDAR specs would just be kind of a catch-all. We don't have time in 20 minutes or whatever to really get into it, but things like point density, your pulse repetition rate, number of returns. Again, what's your application, right? If I'm flying the Amazon rainforest, I better get probably 5, 8, 10 more returns if I can. If I'm doing more, developed areas, maybe a 2-return scanner could work, and there's a bunch of other things go into that. I'll spend most of my time on this RTK versus PPK, and then the compliance piece, but to kind of jump out of order for a second, I already mentioned having a base on site to ensure good mapping accuracy. Again, bring your own receiver. It doesn't have to be very expensive. It's logging static data at 1 second. You'll have good data afterwards, depending on your sensor combination. Always have that, even if it's just a backup, right? Maybe you lose network connectivity to the NCRTN, or whatever the case may be. And then mechanical camera shutter. This is a big one, right? So DJI, again, this is not a DJI commercial. We all love DJI. I love DJI. I wish there were easier ways to still get them, but the point of that is they are really not the only, but one of the few in that kind of entry point small quadcopter who they have a mechanical shutter option, right? That's so critical for mapping. I can go buy a non-Chinese manufactured, 5 to 10 grand quadcopter. Pretty much almost no one in that category puts a mechanical shutter on it, right? Is that crippling? Not necessarily, but if you're trying to do larger area orthos, you're gonna have some image blur issues. So just keep that in mind. Folks go, hey, I'm gonna get this, I'm gonna get that. I'm like, hey, that's great. Are you doing inspection? Well, no. That's gonna have some challenges for you. And then to jump back in order here real quick, so I already kind of mentioned RTK versus PPK. If folks here have done a lot of field collection, whether you're a surveyor or just other things, right? I could log on to the NCRTN, connect to field maps with a decent integrated receiver, and I want to get, a quick shot, right? That's all through the internet. Certain drones, like DJI Enterprise drones, will do that exact same thing. That's for RTK. Sometimes, though, that either becomes unavailable, you're in the middle of nowhere, things of that nature. I might pretend that's my rover right there. Now it's going to broadcast, right, as an in-trip caster. So that's pretty self-explanatory. But like I already mentioned, PPK, having that either as your first line of defense for accuracy, meaning, again, logging static data, grabbing that Rhinex file, going into whatever, if I'm using a FreeFly Astro with an ILX LR1, I'll use FreeFly's geotagging tool. If I'm flying my wing trim, my nice orange VTOL drone, I'll geotag there. So it doesn't particularly matter, minus if you've done that little step, you can always get to pretty good mapping grade results without setting tons and tons of control. And along those lines, let me get a little sip of water here. GCPs versus check shots. I think maybe hopefully most folks in the room are familiar with that distinction. But the point is, I put my checkerboard target out, or maybe I just take a topo shot in the middle of asphalt, right? That's kind of an obvious delineation. I can't pick out that topo shot in my image or my LiDAR point cloud, but I could also have maybe striped chevrons, checkerboards, whatever, and I could exclude them from my processing, right? If we're talking about ASPRS standards or other ways to evaluate the quality of the results, if I've used, let's say, 10 of my targets as control, those aren't independent check shots. Again, I think an obvious statement, but I think worth reminding folks, because if you're not doing that day in and day out, that can kind of get mixed up. And then the last kind of term to know in this space, this could be a whole presentation unto itself. People say, hey, Chris, I'm working for maybe state X, Y, and Z agency. Not a problem yet in North Carolina, fingers crossed. Someone talked to your legislature in Raleigh, let's maybe keep it that way. But I need to be on the blue list. Okay, well, what are you trying to do? Well, I'm just kind of doing, site overviews for a land development client. I'm like, okay, well, are they building at like Fort Bragg? Well, no. I'm like, great, you don't need to worry about probably any of that stuff. right? People get hung up on what they see in all the blogs and things, and there's a reason for the blue list, and we'll explain that in a second. But the kind of tiers you can look at is if my clients are all private, use what you want. Use DJI, it's very affordable, works great, all these sorts of things. Then you could say, all right, well, I want an American-made drone. There's great reasons for that too. I'm not here to dunk on that. We represent a lot of those brands, and they have good options, but you're going to pay a premium, obviously, because it's not made in China. But then the big three here, NDA compliance, this is the most confusing aspect of this, I find, and it's very confusing. That stands for the National Defense Authorization Act. That's actually passed, every year over year. Not every year has drone-related provisions, but there's certain kind of flashpoint years that do. And the point of all that is really about supply chain, right? If you want to call them the big four, maybe we shouldn't say that. I got basketball in the brain for the big four in that. But it's China, thank you, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. If any component, a critical covered component, things like the radio, the flight controller manufactured in those countries, you can't say it's NDA compliant. The really confusing part of that, though, is there's no list, there's no body like DoD does for the blue list. It's just I, as the manufacturer, say, yep, I'm NDA compliant. So it's a self-certification, right? That's where it gets really confusing. That really helps most people kind of future-proof themselves, right? We've not had it in North Carolina. Georgia has a law that's being debated right now. Florida did this kind of famously or infamously a year and a half ago, whatever it was. So the odds are if you're making an investment today in 2025, if you buy NDAA compliance, get that nice check mark from the manufacturer, you can keep using that tool into the future. But if you don't, you buy DJI, again, please talk to your legislators in Raleigh. Maybe we can hold on to that for a while. And then if you are actually working for the Army Corps, for the National Park Service, collaborators like that, obviously the DoD themselves, that's where the blue list comes into the mix. And this will also be very confusing. And if folks are like, I already get this, whatever, just yell at me and we'll move on. But it is a critical thing when it comes to purchasing because DIU just purged the blue list at the beginning of this month. So a lot of airframes, inspired flights options, Wingtra, a whole host of others got booted off the list. The stated reason for that is that, and I get it, they're the DoD, right? It's a war-fighting purpose. They didn't sign up to evaluate a bunch of commercial-grade mapping drones. That's a lot of time and effort for them. The confusing part of that, though, is so many folks have looked at that blue list for years to say, great, I'm going to go fly. I've got customers do this. I'm going to go fly for the Park Service in Alaska in the summer for research or whatever. We bought a blue-listed drone, and now we're told it's not on the blue list, and now all the client knows is, well, you're not on the list. Find something else. And they're like, what am I going to use? None of these drones really do mapping. So that's a whole mess. I think that's going to get rectified, hopefully, in the industry, and that's where the green list comes in. That's meant to be a fail-safe or a replacement, I guess you would say, for the blue list. It's not produced by DoD. It's trying to look at very similar things from supply chain and cybersecurity, but it's just not a government entity. So anyway, more to come on that. Like I said, if you're not working with or not actually the federal government, maybe you're a state government agency trying to kind of thread the needle, NDA compliance is a great way to go, or even back off of that if you don't have to and kind of ride the wave. Because anyway, enough said about that. You can ask me more about it in the Q&A or stop me now. But anyway, just a few other kind of random tips. I'm not going to read all these things on the slides, but things I always think about, again, is what is your use case, right? Are you trying to get a drone program started, maybe at your municipality, at your company, whatever? Maybe start small. Maybe start with providing your clients that nice aerial video fly-through, right? Pretty simple. Go buy that at Best Buy, not a lot of investment. People get hooked on that. Oh, I love this visualization. Maybe move on to something enterprise and for mapping, right? Again, always matching. If I want to use an AI model from the prior presentation that doesn't need super high-res GSD, then maybe you don't need a drone for that project at all, right? Kind of obvious things. More stuff. I got to get the slides posted to the conference thing. You can read through more of these things here. From an aircraft selection perspective, again, just a lot of good ideas, things to be aware of. A quick side note, and I'm not going to name the name of the manufacturer, but a customer I once said, hey, I'm comparing option A and option B. When I Google option A, I get hundreds of hits, all the knowledge-based articles and whatever, and people are using it, and there's videos. Google option B, and they're actually spec'd quite similarly. I get their website. And I'm like, yeah, you can kind of draw the conclusion you would expect from that point. And I'm not saying that to insult the one manufacturer, but that is an issue, right? Drones are relatively immature as an industry on the commercial side of things. There's a lot of really cool ideas. I love those companies who are pushing the envelope, but some are barely past out of the garage stage. And I mean no offense when I say that, but when you're making a really substantial investment, you got to keep that in mind too, right? Can I get batteries for this in the next 6 or 12 months? Can I get spare parts? Is their ecosystem more open and allows me to customize? Some are closed for very good reasons. Pretty much all fixed wings are, because you're going to probably mess up the center of gravity and have some other issues. So there's balance to all of that. But people get all excited. I'm like, hey, that's exciting, but just you got to know what you're getting into, right? Again, I think kind of an obvious statement. And yeah, enough said about that. And then extras you typically need, right? And I'll make this point later too, but you don't have to maybe start from whole cloth, right? We're probably all using, if not ArcGIS, maybe QGIS or whatever. So we've got some good mapping software to deal with all this in the end. All we're doing is measuring and collecting the initial data differently, right? But you're gonna have to insert some new software into the mix, right? If you wanna stay in Azure, I got a slide for this later, maybe it's gonna be Drone to Map, maybe it's Site Scan, maybe it's ArcGIS Reality. I always forget how they name that now. It's like extension for Pro or whatever, but you're gonna need something to take these raw images and produce some kind of output in Ortho Point Cloud. Again, obvious statement. But that could be a new license with your Esri rep, it could be Pix4D, it could be whatever. But in so doing that, if you're not running a lot of AI models or really kind of bandwidth heavy processing today, a lot of folks, thank you, will say, oh, I've got my nice CAD machine, I'm doing all this drafting, now I'm just gonna start running and crunch, 10,000 images. Probably not, you might need to beef up your computing power. Again, obvious statement. We could talk about targeting, you gotta have the right kind of target, know what your software is, right? Pix4D, I think they're expanding now, but used to be, get a 2 foot by 2 foot, checkerboard, bam, that's gonna auto match, right? Other software have different templates they might prefer. Drone insurance, FAA registration, that's a $5 fee per drone, not a big deal. And then of course, having your Part 107, I say that too, it's really an imprecise way to talk because that's just a regulation, but you have your remote pilot certificate, right? And it's worth mentioning too, if folks are used to, I think about this from my old tree work days, if the office or the company has a spraying license, I don't have to also be licensed, I'm under someone else's license. That is not true with drones. I have to have a Part 107 certified person to be colloquial, standing within access to me, or maybe if they have a controller A and B, right? I can't go out and fly on behalf of that person without holding my license directly or having someone with me. So keep that in mind. A question that actually I got recently too was, well, now that I've got my Part 107, is all this considered, under that when I'm flying, maybe just for fun? And the answer is no. But once you have your Part 107, you could take that Mavic on the weekends and maybe do something else. So it doesn't really matter basically once you've done that. But if it's a commercial operation, you've got to have that certificate. The FAA does not mess around when it comes to fines. We've all seen maybe some of those news stories lately. So I would not recommend trying them on that. Back to the base station point really quick, and I'm running low on time. I've already kind of said all this, but baseline distance from wherever your flight area is to that base, that's critical, right? Depending on the software, depending on the sensor that you use, you might be able to kick that out a little bit further. Certain solutions are like, nope, you're just not going to be able to process that trajectory for like a LiDAR flight if that baseline is greater than that cutoff. We're obviously spoiled here. If you didn't know, I think most of us know in North Carolina, our CORS network is so incredibly dense. I don't think a single one is outputting at less than a 1 second logging interval, so that really makes this very convenient for us. If we go to pretty much all of our neighbors, South Carolina is kind of halfway, half not, because they kind of bury it on their own site, but the point is you can't just roll up to some random spot and say, I want to fly today. I'm sure NGS has a CORS station nearby. Not necessarily. In North Carolina, almost always yes, but other states, not so much. Setting control, I talked about GCPs versus check shots before. If you're like me, I came up, again, proud Tar Heel, right? We didn't do any field collection at all. I think we had a GPS in our hands for 5 minutes in one class. Maybe that was an oversight, but if you're not used to doing that field collection, more of a survey type of function, targeting matters, right? Targeting and that control that you set, everything kind of emanates from that, at least from a validation perspective. So these are actually more scanning targets you see on the screen, all reflective. I like to use some of the mesh kind of stakeable targets as well in whatever shape you want. Usually it's a checkerboard, or it could be they call it the iron cross, whatever. Match that to your software to make life easier. And then I know I'm really low on time now, so we'll blow through this. When you're flying LiDAR, literally just the point I'm gonna make, when you're flying a LiDAR mission versus photogrammetry mission, your overlaps and altitudes are very different, right? There's range limitations of certain LiDARs. You're not gonna fly at 400 feet and expect to get a 1/10 of a foot vertical if the sensor's not rated for that, for all kinds of reasons. Also your overlap, and I think this is an obvious point, I should have had a graphic for it, but I'm not gonna overlap my LiDAR flight 70+%. That's just an unnecessary amount of side lap. But for photos, obviously the software is going to stitch all these things together into the model. You've got to have sufficient overlap. So the point of all that is I could have the exact same tool, let's say a DJI M350 with an L2. If I care about the photo output, my mission parameters are very different than the LiDAR output, right? Again, maybe an obvious statement. And this is one slide to kind of try to sum all this stuff up. I don't know if folks are government, if you're private, whatever your role may be, but if you're trying to add drones to the toolbox, thank you. Again, it's, well, what's the way to justify the budget first, right? Public safety is often a great one, But the challenge for you if you're on the GIS department is you don't want that electronic shutter, you don't want thermal bandness, or you want a mapping solution. So there can be ways to kind of hitch things together. I've also seen that though, where certain, hey, like we've got our parks department wants it, and engineering wants it, and 10 departments want it, and no one can make up their minds, right? That never happens. So you got to balance, find that pathway for you to get the tool in your hands. And then, like I said, we'll kind of just breeze through this, but who's going to do it? Who's going to get their remote pilot certificate? Who's going to kind of manage the program from the flight side? And that can be daunting, maybe who's going to take that on, but once you've got that kind of in place, maybe it's the whole team. At the end of the day, images are images, right? I don't care if they're from a satellite, if they're from a plane, if they're from a drone. You're going to work with those the same. You're going to train your models through the Esri deep learning library or your own. So you're all kind of getting to the same place. Again, I'll just jump to number 8 here too. It is really difficult right now for folks trying to make these purchasing decisions. Well, what's going to happen in Washington? Who knows what's going to happen in Raleigh? Who knows that either? So it really is a tough time to say, I'm just going to get my program started. You could make a relatively inexpensive DJI investment today. Maybe that's taken away from you tomorrow, or at least severely restricted. And you just got to kind of spin that roulette wheel a little bit and kind of work with it. I reference this very quickly. I know I'm out of time. ArcGIS, there's really 4 main flavors at this point to work with your incoming images. Not all of these are even drone specific. Drone to map certainly is. The top 2 about Reality Studio and Reality for ArcGIS Pro, that could be manned imagery, that could be a whole host of different things. So I suspect if you didn't pay for that with your license, you probably got to give Esri some more money, and that's fine. These tools are very powerful, but talk to your Esri rep about that, and you can kind of spin that up for your program. And then I won't let this play, but a quick side note there is, so ArcGIS Flight is the new rebrand of SiteScan, which that always was confusing because there was SiteScan to actually fly the drone versus SiteScan on the desktop. It's now rebranded as ArcGIS Flight. They pretty much, as a lot of companies do, it's all DJI for the most part that they support to actually control that with the iPad, but FreeFly Astro is a key exception, and that was just a nice little marketing video that they just put out at the week of Esri Federal or so, that the latest version, the Astro Max, is now also supported in ArcGIS Flight. So again, if you're trying to future-proof your investment in those sorts of directions, there are compliant options, whether it's American-made, NDAA, Blue List, whatever, and it's going to take a little while, I think, for the market to kind of catch up and support those integrations, right, and things like that. And then maybe the last thing real quick, this will be in the uploaded slides. These are actually not so much GIS examples per se, minus that third example for the city. But again, I think it's an obvious, there's just so many ways we can use these tools. Find one that justifies the use case, get yourself started, and you'll find yourself adding more sensors, adding more drones. You might talk about a fixed wing solution for the efficiency, for mapping, and then you'll get some kind of quadcopter for inspection and so on and so forth. So a lot of ways to do it. Here's some just ROI examples really quick for a few different customers. And then maybe the last thing I'll say is emerging trends wise, there's going to be a lot of stuff, at least allegedly evolving from the FAA by this year as far as beyond visual line of sight, ops over people, all these sorts of things. So again, if you were in the earlier presentation, I can't fly my drone from here, yonder, down whatever road. There's line of sight issues at some point. The drone can technically, still have a link, but there's also the people who are not part of my operation, right, who I'm flying over. And when you get your Part 107, when you go through all that process, you'll understand what those limitations are. But there's no question that in the current regulatory environment from the FAA perspective, there are a lot of kind of things you got to navigate to really maximize the use of the tool. So if you have a self-contained site, if I work for City X, I'm flying my park, maybe I close the park, maybe I fly at off times, I'm probably in a good spot, right? If I'm gonna go fly downtown Winston, and I could totally do that with a lot of different tools, I'm in a very gray area, right, of all these people who did not sign up to be under my drone flight, that kind of thing. So you gotta really balance that. But the really cool part with that stuff is, as the regulations evolve, things like DJI's Dock 3 and other Dock drone-in-a-box solutions that you're seeing, I won't play this, we have no time, but you're getting to the point you could roll up with your truck, pop the tailgate, say go, and that drone will now autonomously capture that site without even being pre-planned necessarily. So we're getting to a really cool spot where the technology is. It's just a question of regulatory, both from country of origin and all the other things the FAA kind of allowing for this to be used to its maximum potential. So anyway, I'll kind of wrap it up there. We'll skip past that. Obvious statement, I kind of said this before, last thing I'll say maybe, you don't have to get a drone, right? You can use imagery from all other sorts of means, and you can process drone imagery once you've got that initial output in very similar ways, right? Maybe you're using AI to detect trees, maybe you're using detect poles, whatever it is. I tell this to my survey customers all the time. I could take 1,000 topo shots and interpolate that into a surface, or I could have 100 million aerial LiDAR shots and decimate them down to a surface, right? I ended up the exact same place. It's just how I got there. Same applies if you're doing 3D modeling or whatever else the case may be. So I know that was super fast. We'll take questions down really quick, and please come see us and my colleagues at the booth. We'd love to talk about anything else, drones or Trimble as well for the rest of the conference. So thank you. Yes.
Question. I wonder if you could talk about the implications of the 108 licensing supposedly coming down the pipe.
Yep. So at this point, I don't think anyone has seen, I haven't checked in the last several weeks, like the FAA is supposed to, I think, put stuff out there for like comment and all these sorts of things. Nothing has actually happened to my knowledge about that. So will they actually have those new Part 108 rules by September? I honestly kind of doubt it. But everyone's hinging a lot of hope on, again, maximizing, like I said, the tool and not being so encumbered by like, I could send this thing 5 miles that way and I can use sensors on, all these things to be safe. But the FAA, at least to this point, that's a waiver situation, and those waivers are slightly easier to come by. I know certain customers who have gotten waivers in the last several months once they kind of loosened it a little bit, but it's still a bit of a mess. I hope it's by September, likely going to be past that for sure. That's a great question. Any other questions? Yes?
Base station setup is required or is optional?
So totally depends. Yeah, the question was, is base station setup required? Not required. It depends on what you're doing, obviously, and like, am I just doing inspection, something like that? But if you are doing a mapping grade project, if you don't do that, depending on the airframe and sensor you're using, for LiDAR, I would say absolutely all the time. But for photogrammetry, you might have an RTK connection capability on the drone, or just set more control, right? The idea being, if I'm flying over like the swamp or something, I'm not going to be able to set enough targets, there's not enough perimeter roads or whatever the case may be. I'm almost stuck with the base, and I'll get pretty decent, couple centimeter accuracy now for my geotags. But if I'm in a situation where I can set enough control, or my drone is RTK enabled, not necessarily, but it's always a good fail-safe to ensure good quality, for sure, for sure. All right, any other questions? If not, we'll be here. I'll be here all week, so, and go Tar Heels today.